For me, it's always been a pleasure to introduce the many repeat performers, the great scholars who have visited us on and off. But I must say there's nothing as exciting as to introduce a speaker who is speaking to us at our forum for the first time. And such is the case today. Our speaker is Marlene Laruelle. She is Research Professor of International Affairs and Associate Director of the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. This is a very well-known university, and it should be perhaps more widely broadcast that we had partnered with them in a very major international conference in 1996 on the occasion of the 5th anniversary of Ukrainian independence. So it feels partially like, we're family already. She is co-director of PONAR's Eurasia and director of the Central Asia program at GW. She works on political, social, and cultural changes in Russia and Central Asia, especially through the prism of ideologies and nationalism, as those of you who have seen the title of today's presentation will quickly recognize. She is the author of 3 monographs, as well as many other shorter studies. The relevance of these studies are to what we're living through these days are evident in their very titles, so I'll just read those. Russian Eurasianism, an ideology of empire. Empire, a theme very much close to the heart of the Ukrainian Research Institute in its various guises. And the name of the nation, another favorite theme. Nationalism and politics in contemporary Russia. And Eurasianism and the European far right, reshaping the Russia-Europe relationship. She's now working on a monograph on the repertoire of fascism in Russia to be published by Pittsburgh University Press. I would only add that I'm really delighted that she will be speaking to us on fascistic, Russian nationalism and the war in Ukraine, the semantics of fascism and conservatism in Russia. I think it's high time that someone dealt with some of this terminology which is used and bandied about left and right on all continents, including in our own country over the past year or so, without really delving into what really lies behind these and whether the terms reflect the realities. I imagine that it will be partly what you will be talking about. My own favorite example of how sometimes terminology and what people really think may be mismatched was in a comment made by one of the Ukrainian separatists in the Donbass early on. I think it was still in 2014 when he was calling the government in Kiev as a government of Nazis and anti-Semites run by Jews. So the combination of anti-Semitism and Nazism and this overrepresentation of Jews, I thought was rather interesting. So I hope that we can get at the root of some of these issues. So it's my pleasure. Marlene Laruelle, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your kind words, for your invitation, and for being here today. As it was told, I will be presenting something which is part of a volume that will be published somewhere this year that I already submitted to Pittsburgh University Press about the symbolic landscapes of this terminology of fascism in Russia. And some people in the room, Nina, were participating in a book incubator we had a few months ago about the book itself, and that really helped me reshaping a lot of things. So what I will be specifically looking at today, because I wanted it, of course, to be connected to Ukraine, is to see, as it was said, the kind of semantic space used by the Russian terminology of fighting against fascism and promoting Russia as the symbol of conservative values, and how these two frames or repertoire are connected, what are the kind of ambiguity that are going over between when they overlap and when they dissociate. And what I will try to show you is that, in fact, what is really underlying this relationship between the two terms is the relationship to Europe. And through this, the way they are negotiated, Russia is in fact trying to reformulate what it would like to be the relationship to Europe. So in a sense, Ukraine is a kind of embodiment of this fight around who is part of Europe, who is not, around these two terms. So I think that may, just to give you the context, and I guess many people here are following that very closely, everything related to the Ukrainian crisis, and here I use the term of crisis in a larger sense to include the war itself, but also all the political crises before the war, seen from the Russian prism, was really a kind of reenactment of the Great Patriotic War, and that's how it was framed by the Russian authorities, with a lot of visuals, elements that really play a big role on the way things are framed. Putin himself has never directly labeled the Poroshenko government as fascist, but he used several metaphors that are, as we will say, a combination of both having historical connotation and some more contemporary one. He mentioned the Ukrainian government in its famous March 18 speech about the annexation of Crimea. You can read them. Then at another moment, he drew parallels between the Ukrainian crisis itself and the Great Patriotic War, with each time allusion to nationalism, Nazi, Russophobia, anti-Semitism, Bandera, Hitler. So the classic kind of terminology that the Russian government has been using to label the crisis. Some members of the Russian government have been even more clear or bold in their statement. That was the case of Alexei Pushkov, for example, declaring that Ukraine has formed a nationalist dictatorship with an obvious Nazi color. And of course, we could discuss about on the way the division of labor between what Putin is saying and what some of members of his government are saying, and the different terminology used in each case. The media have been very much involved, and here you can enjoy one of the classic symbol you can find online to describe on the Russian nationalist website mostly this kind of so-called Ukrainian fascist junta. You will enjoy the CIA all being also here. So it's really the Russian media world that was the most involved in labeling the Ukrainian government with everything related to fascism or Nazism. What was interesting, and there have been several studies done on the way the Russian TV reported about the Ukrainian events, and I'm just summarizing the research that has been done on that topic. First element, of course, private sector, Svoboda, were always presented as the kind of the leading political forces behind the Poroshenko government, so to really accentuate the nationalism aspect. All the traditional cliché of Ukrainophobia, as Ukrainians being only puppets, having no identity, being divided between different worlds, so civilization, so topics that are very traditional for the Russians' narrative about Ukraine since 19th century. Also very kind of updated use of fascisti, banderovci to define Ukrainian in general, and here also a long history of Soviet roots for this terminology. As I said, this also dating from Cold War trope on CIA as supporting hidden Nazi all over Europe, so really a reactualization, re-updating of old Soviet terminology in judging the Ukrainian elements. There have been tons of declaration and statement. I just put this one that I would like after to discuss by this Mikhail Myarkov, who is one of the big historians on the Second World War. What I found interesting, and you will see how I will bring it after in the discussion, is this notion that Nazism is again coming to us from Europe, and that the from Europe that I would like also to develop, because you have this kind of special geographical aspect of something when you are in Russia, seen from Russia coming from the West. If you look, and there have been also several research done here it's in Google, but you can do the same kind of research on Vkontakte, the main Russian the equivalent of Google, to see how much the terminology of fascism was discussed. Usually, fascism is discussed online around May 9th, so it's always with kind of historical aspect. Clearly, during the crisis, it was not related to May 9th. It was very actively discussed at the core of the crisis, and then you can see every year around the kind of anniversary of the beginning of the, not the beginning, but let's say the peak moment of March, April 2015, 2016, we see this kind of peak of activities of online discussion about fascism, and always connected to Ukraine now, and no more or less to May 9th and a historical event. We had the same for Banderovci, but as you can see, it was very largely discussed in 2014, and then it kind of slowed down. Yes?
Did you say Kontakty is the equivalent of Google in Russia? Did I hear that right?
No, sorry, I wanted to say Yandex.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, sorry. Yandex has, so we run, I don't have it here, but we run it also on Yandex, and there have been several research done, and it shows more or less the same thing, that during the crisis, the term fascism was really connected to what was happening in Ukraine and not to the memory of the war itself. All social media have been very active in kind of labeling Ukraine as the fascist government. I just collected some visuals. Visuals play really a very big role in Russian nationalist movement. They are the way to kind of spread very radical view. I just put some of them. You can see there are tons of them that have been produced by Russian either nationalist websites and social media, or more kind of mainstream online website also. Of course, the Novorossiya narrative coming from Russia has been shaped at the kind of mirror game in this updating of the Second World War, presenting the fighters in Donbass as being the heirs of the partisani of the Second World War partisans. Another terminology that was also very much used was the one of opolchency, also used during Second World War to describe Soviet partisans, but also, and that's an older term coming from to describe the 17th century fight of the Moscow inhabitants population against the Polish-Lithuanian invasion. So really reactivation of a lot of historical tropes that really contributed to the success of this narrative about seeing the conflict as being a kind of new Second World War. Of course, the use of the St. George ribbon has been also very widely become a very kind of symbolic trade or brand of the Novorossiya fights and narratives, which is still very much used today. It's Igor Strelkov, one of the main warlords of the Donbass insurgency during the first months of the 2014 crisis. I've been discussing in other places about the different ideological reading of these Novorossiya arguments, some being very kind of nostalgic of the Soviet Union, some being very reenacting the fascist narrative, and the other reenacting the kind of white immigration narrative. That's why I call that the three colors of Novorossiya, depending on the different nationalist groups on the Russian side. There were several ways of framing the colors, the ideological colors of the fight in the Donbass. As I told you, I think something very important that we tend to overlook in the Russian narrative, it's how much it's geographically shaped. The parallel online and the number of discussion about fascism, Nazi, and the European Union as being the same kind of project because it's coming from Europe is really impressive, and that's something I was not prepared to see. So for those of you who don't read Russian, it's saying the European choice of Ukraine, showing Nazi, and here Hitler was the first to try to create the European Union. And so there is really this notion that NATO, EU expansion is coming from the West to attack or undermine Russia, as Nazi Germany did. And this parallel is a quite powerful one if you look on some sociological survey we have about this perception of the danger is coming from the West, which means that it has geopolitical also kind of, it's part of a geopolitical imaginary about what the West, about the threats coming from the West. Another important aspect of this Russian narrative, and that's where all the ambiguities is arriving, is of course the fact that Russia has been activating a lot of far-right partners and allies all over Europe, including also here in the US in a more modest way. And that's where we have all these ambiguities of Russia saying it's fighting against fascism, while at the same time it's creating political alliance with people or groups from the far right that we would traditionally consider as being on one way or another the heirs of the same fascists that Russia said it has been fighting against now. And I will explain how this ambiguities is kind of articulated by the Russian political elites. This politics of connecting with European far right, it's a complex one because in fact it's a very decentralized policy. And I think that's really important to realize how much, in fact, many aspects of this kind of policy in Russia are decentralized. There is really room for what I call ideological entrepreneurs to develop, take shape, and decide for different policies. That's why sometimes it looks contradictory, because it's not coming from one core source. It's just an open space in which the regime is giving kind of room of maneuver and autonomy for some personality to develop some kind of connection. And this connection can be contradictory because you have several ideological niches or entrepreneurs who are competing with each other to capture this market in the name of the Kremlin. So you have multiplicity of actors. You have all the big names of the Russian nationalist groups from the 90s, Alexander Dugin, Vladimir Zhirinovsky, Sergei Glaziev, Eduard Limonov, who have been developing connection with the European far rights in the 90s. Except Glaziev, you cannot consider them as being part of the Russian establishment. Glaziev is the only one having an official position now as Putin's advisor for the Eurasian Economic Union and being connected not so much to Europe but to some groups in the US, especially to LaRouche and so on. Dugin, Zhirinovsky, Limonov have more kind of traditional connection with the European far right, mostly the French, Italian, Belgian, German. What seems to me very important is that the Russian Orthodox Church has been playing not only since 2014, but very clearly since that date, a growing role in connecting and in serving as a legitimizing institution to make connection with the European far right. The same for white emigre circles who have been reactivated by Russia to kind of act as mediator or as the bridge, as the go-between between the European far rights and Russia. And then Dmitry Rogozin, who is the deputy prime minister in charge of the military-industrial complex now in Russia, but also the informal leader of the Rodina party, has been in fact kind of delegated by the Kremlin the role of outreach, this role of outreach toward the European far right. It's quite ambiguous to know what is really happening inside the presidential administration and the Russian government on that issue. We know that there are several groups competing with each other. Some are in favor of this connection with the European far right. So Rogozin, of course, that was also the case of Sergei Narishkin, who was the Speaker of the Duma. We know that some other personalities are not in favor of that and consider it's a strategic mistake for Russia to be too closely associated to European far right. We know Shoigu, for example, is again that. So we have some elements about who is thinking what, but of course it's not so easy to know. What seems to me important is that, in fact, Russia's connection to European far right is in fact a sign of its failure at succeeding in securing the support of European mainstream parties. And that's why it's an ambiguous one, and I will come back on these issues of getting support from mainstream conservative actors in Europe, and that's where you will see also this overlapping interaction between what is fascism, what is conservatism. So, as we said, Russia is really presenting itself like the savior or the herald of European conservative values. These narratives, we tend to see it as having emerged only quite recently during Putin's third terms. In fact, it was already there in the church narrative since the early 2000s. And the church was the first institution to really begin this outreach in Europe toward conservative groups sharing the same Christian values, but this conservative group could be also connected to European far right. So this narrative has been there, and these actions have been there organized by the church since the early 2000s, especially at the time when the church was trying to sign the canonical reconciliation with the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, and that was part, and so you had all these fights about reconquering parishes in Europe and so on, and that's where the church really began active abroad. Then something interesting that I run a kind of statistical overview of the number of times Putin, Medvedev, and other officials of the Russian government mention Russia as a civilization. And that's interesting to see that in the beginning of the 2000s, and it didn't stop now, there are more mention of Russia as the branch of European civilization than Russia as the specific Eurasian civilization. So that's interesting to see that this narrative about Russia as part of Europe is already there since the early 2000s and didn't really stop even now in a time of crisis. It's in the second half of the 2000s that this representation of Russia as the symbol of European conservative values take a more foreign policy-oriented narrative, especially in Putin's speeches when he began, and of course the big symbol of that has been his Munich speech in 2007, saying that Russia is here to defend the Westphalian world order and to protect state sovereignty against multilateral institution and foreign intervention or interference and so on. And that's in fact connected to the way Russia wants to see Europe, and I will be coming back to that a little bit later. And then it's really 2012 where we see this, what we have been labeled, this conservative turn of the presidential administration, promoting so-called traditional values, traditional mores, heterosexual family, and so on. So this got really officialized after the Bolotnaya protest of 2011-12, but as you can see, there is already 1 decade of history of Russia beginning to play this European conservative value card. That's a very famous Putin speech of 2013, very interesting to read. Just a short quotation, but the whole text is really interesting about the positioning of Russia as defending conservative values, Christian values, and therefore European values. So what we see is that, in fact, the use of this conservative repertoire is intimately connected to the use of Russia as part of Europe and Russia representing the authentic conservative Europe. It's not only targeted to Europe, because Russia is also using this conservatism and this conservative value repertoire when it's negotiating with Middle Eastern countries, so the same kind of global fight against, the decadent West, recognizing homosexuality and so on. So this line of narrative is also useful in foreign policy toward Middle East and Asia, but it's mostly toward Europe that Russia used it to make the connection between being a conservative power, meaning being a European power. So what we see is this revival of this narrative of Russia as the guardian of authentic Europe. And that's really impressive if you read some of Putin's speeches and you compare them with classic 19th century Slavophile narrative. It's almost word for word reproduction of this narrative of Russia as the second Europe, so the heir of Byzance, Constantinople, with this notion that the second Europe is in fact the real authentic one because the first Europe is losing its own identity. There have been, and that's visible since 2014 mostly, so that's a result of the Ukrainian crisis, a new focus on classical antiquity by the Russian cultural policy. There have been a series of exhibitions in Moscow and St. Petersburg about the Greek, Roman world. There have been a very impressive exchange of exhibition between the Tretyakov Gallery and the Vatican. If you go to Washington, you can visit now the new Museum of the Bible that opened a few months ago, and it has a section given of paintings, Christian paintings given by the Tretyakov Gallery. So Russia is playing that card also in the cultural field. You have another aspect that is also becoming more and more visible. It was already there since a long time in Russia, since the 90s, but it's become more and more official with this narrative about Russia being a Nordic and Aryan country that may seem contradictory with Russia being the heir of Byzance, but in fact it's not. The two of them can be connected. I mentioned here this film Vikings because Putin has been attending the film. There have been several officials who were there to see the film, so giving it a kind of official validation as something that's the film that is saying something about Russian identity. I say that this Russia playing this authentic Europe card is also closely, or it has been accentuated since the Ukrainian crisis, and I think here it's very visible. You now can see how the presidential administration has to integrate Crimea and therefore to revive a narrative about the Pontic worlds as being part of Russian European sign of Russia belonging to Europe. And so there have been a lot of work devoted officially by several think tanks, but also, just by the funds the presidential administration is giving to several artistic or cultural or educational projects about refocusing toward the Black Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean world as being part of Russia's tradition. And the fact of controlling Crimea is, of course, pushing toward that direction. And that's where I think it's really also connected to what is happening globally. Russia's involvement on the Syrian war theater has been really important. You remember this Mariinsky Orchestra concert in Palmyra. If you read Russian new military conception, the narrative about Russia needs to be present in the Mediterranean Sea is really also a revival of 19th century tradition of dominating Eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea. So all that is this connection back to the Constantinople legacy that I think is really important to have in view on. So Russia is not only presenting itself as the authentic Europe through the promotion of so-called conservative values, it has also this kind of cultural, geographical element that is connected Russia to the Black Sea region, and therefore Crimea is now totally integrated into this kind of narrative about Russia pushing toward the southwestern part of Europe. As I said, the connection to the far right is partly the result of the fact that Russia failed at reaching out mainstream conservative party in Europe. And that's where this conservative narrative of Russia didn't succeed as the presidential administration wanted it to kind of secure the support of European conservative party. You know that there was a lot of supporter before the Ukrainian crisis for Russia, the so-called Putin Versteher in Germany, that didn't protect it or secure Germany's support during the Ukrainian crisis. So the relationship with the CDU, CSU in Germany is a difficult one. in the French political landscape, the connection to the main conservative party, Les Républicains, has also been partly failing. Russia was hoping to get either Marine Le Pen or François Fillon elected during the French presidential election, so two very pro-Russian candidates, none of them passed. In the UK, the relationship with the Conservative Party are also difficult. The one with business circles are there, of course, because many of the big European firms want to do business in Russia and therefore are lobbying these main conservative parties to be more friendly to Russia, but that has not been enough. So in terms of foreign policy, these strategies of Russia to play the conservative card didn't really result in what the Russian government was attending. And then we have this very complex situation of what is happening in Central Europe with so-called illiberal government in power. So in some case, that play in favor of Russia. We see it with Orban in Hungary. We see it with the newly elected political figure and president in Bulgaria, in Moldova. But that's his homegrown phenomenon. That's not a product of Russian influence. And I think on that we should be very careful when we tend to always interpret this rise of illiberal values and populist figures in Europe as kind of a product of Russia. It's not. It's a product of European societies, but it's kind of going with what Russia would like to see. And Russia is playing on that card, but it doesn't mean Russia controls these cards. I think if the European political landscape was suddenly evolving, Russia would lose this kind of connection. And a good example is to follow what is happening in Poland, also a very liberal government with a lot of memory issues, but nothing connected to Russia in the sense that you cannot consider this Polish government as being a pro-Russian one. So it's really to show that, in fact, the connection to Russia by this illiberal government is not a guarantee. It's not because they are illiberal that they will be pro-Russian. A good example is that so Rogozin's party, Rodina, in 2015 organized a big international Russian conservative forum where they were really hoping to show Russia as the leader of this wave of conservative values in Europe. The forum was a total failure because only very radical far-right groups attended, and so radical that even the French National Front wasn't present because it was even too radical for them to attend. And so we know there have been a lot of tension between this Rodina party and the presidential administration because the party sold to the presidential administration the fact that they would be able to get all these conservative figures in support of Russia, and they obviously failed. And so that's where, since that time, that there have been a lot of discussion inside the presidential administration to know if it was the right strategy to have. We could, of course, discuss what we think about the structural change in this attempt by Russia to target mainstream conservative party in Europe or in the US, but we have seen that that's not because you elect a president that is a pro-Russian one on many aspects, that the party line will really change and that the policy impact of that would be helpful for Russia. So if we put these two kind of lines of narrative, the one about Russia fighting against fascism and the one about Russia presenting itself as leading the conservative value revival in Europe, we can see that they are both sometimes overlapping in their strategy, sometimes being contradictory to each other. And to try to disentangle a little bit more this interaction, the third element to bring into consideration is this European memory wars that is really the context in which these two repertoires are used. We are now in a situation where it's clearly there is no unified pan-European memory of the Second World War, and I think it's really interesting to remember that the main memory wars between, on one side, the Baltic states, Poland, sometimes Ukraine, now more clearly Ukraine than before, Russia on the other side, really became very visible after 2004, which is the time where this country of Central Europe and the Baltic states entered the European Union. So it's intimately connected to to the European Union expansion and to the will of Central European and Eastern European countries to bring what they consider their memory narrative into a pan-European framework. What we are now, we are in a situation of having two different narratives that are contradicting each other. The first one, which is the old one, the one we had during the decades of the Cold War, see 1945 as the victory and the Yalta World Order as what happened after the kind of legitimate, it was not always considered as totally legitimate, but accepted world order and division of Europe. This narrative was shared by the US, by Western Europe, and by the Soviet Union until at least the collapse of the Soviet Union, if not later. And it's still very much in use. If you go, for example, to the Museum of Holocaust in Washington, a lot of their exhibitions are still representing this kind of traditional, conventional view of the memory narrative. And then we have the new one, the one that Central European and Eastern European countries have brought onto the table in the 2000s, saying 1945, a kind of very strange victory where, as the Lithuanian president say, we traded Hitler for Stalin. And Yalta Order as being not something legitimate, but as being 4 decades during which part of Europe was not authorized to be Europe. Okay, so a very critical narrative promoted by this so-called New Europe against not only Russia, but against also the old Western Europe. And I think inside the European Union structure, you can see these two lines of narrative being there, conflicting with each other, with no way to find a narrative that would kind of reconcile them. And of course, the big issue is to know in that case on which side is Russia. On the side, do we want to see Russia on with the old frame or with the new one? And there are, in fact, 3 lines of discussion that are going on in parallel in each country, and that makes things quite challenging. The first one, of course, and that's the most obvious, is the interpretation of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact and the discussion about do we consider that communism, or at least Stalinism and Nazism, should be equated. That's the narrative coming from a lot of Central European, Eastern European countries, a narrative which is, of course, not only refused by Russia, but which was not part of the Western European narrative until very recently, and is still not totally accepted. The other one, which is more for domestic audience, is to know how to manage the nation's master narrative. It's usually easier to give room for victims. It's more difficult to know if we want to label perpetrator, at which level. Do we want to name those who have been responsible for mass murdering and so on? And of course, the big issue that all Central Eastern Europe is facing is this issue of how to reintegrate on one way or another the role of collaborationist movement in national history. It's a big issue that will probably take decades to solve, and I can tell you, as a French citizen, we haven't solved it on our side. It's still something very sensitive. It is in every country that had very strong collaborationist movement. It's never easy to find how to frame them in the national narrative. The Russian perception on this memory war situation can be shown in several points, and then I will make the connection with the fascism, conservatism repertoire. Of course, the Russian official narrative, there is no way communism can be equated with Nazism, and the simple discussion of that is a kind of disrespect toward the memory of the Second World War, which is really seen as something holy for Russia and therefore untouchable. The legal position of Russia has been very clearly formulated since 2010. The Russian Federation fulfills the international obligation of the Soviet Union, but do not recognize any moral responsibility or any legal obligation for crimes committed by the Soviet authorities. It's clearly formulated. It's, of course, refused and recused by the Baltic states and several other, Ukraine also, and by several other, Poland, several other countries. something which is really interesting that we sometimes tend to forget is that for Russia, the Nuremberg trials are holy. War crimes are only those who are mentioned in the trials. The Soviet crimes not being really mentioned in the trial, they are kind of outside the framework that Russia is ready to recognize. That's why Russia is so much about the Nuremberg trial and the Yalta Order, because that's a time where the narrative about Soviet violence in occupied territory was not really kind of mentioned or discussed. So any kind of discussion about transitional justice, restitution, compensation that the Baltic states have been asking since the 90s are just totally refused on the Russian side. The traditional vision also on the Russian side, the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, was just the response to the Munich agreements, because Western European countries refused to sign a non-aggression pact with Moscow, and therefore Moscow had to protect itself and sign the agreements. You know the classic story. It has been revived recently at several occasions by Putin's very ambiguous statement about the value of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. And so seen from the Russian side, it's in fact with Eastern and Central Europe, which is promoting revisionism, a revisionism of the Yalta Order. So the Russian narrative, and that has been clearly formulated by Lavrov, by several other Russian officials, is that the West was fine with the Yalta Order and this kind of conventional reading of the Second World War. Why are you suddenly changing your mind and promoting a narrative coming from Central and Eastern Europe? So the revisionism is not coming from the Russian side, but from the Western side. That's the Russian perception of this conflict. Another element, and I won't have time to develop on that, but very briefly, is that in Russia itself, contrary to what is often said, the narrative on Stalin's crimes has been also evolving. And what we see now is that it's not that it's forbidden, and there have been several measures and symbolic gestures by Putin at Butovo and at several other kind of commemoration places saying that Stalin's committed crimes. But what is happening is that this narrative is being refused. It's no more now controlled by liberal institutions, NGOs like Memorial. It has been given to the Russian Orthodox Church, because the Russian Orthodox Church allow for saying that Stalin committed some crime without judging the value of the Soviet regime and therefore the value of the Putin regimes. So the church allowed to commemorate and mourn without judging politically. And that's something that the way the regimes is negotiating these kind of memory issues by securing, in fact, so it's authorized to discuss Stalin's crime if you discuss them under the label of the church as a purely kind of emotional mourning without any political judgment about either the connection between Stalinism and the current Russia, or between communism and the current Russian regime, or without making the equation between Stalin's crime and Nazi crimes. So if we put these three, so the fascism, conservatism, and the memory war together, we see that in the Russian narrative, fascism is the contrary of conservatism. Conservatives are those who want to rescue Europe, and fascists are those who want to destroy the conservative Europe. So conservatives are those who are promoting Christian values, as we saw. There are those who are defending classical Western civilization. It can be both in the sense of antiquity or in the sense of defending a Westphalian order of state sovereignty against multilateral institutions. But it's also, and that's where the connection is made, the conservatives are those who respect Yalta Order and the conventional readings of the victory during the Second World War. These ones are put on the side of the conservatives because they are not changing the readings of history and accept the one that has been the conventional one for decades. Fascisti, on the other side, can be so all those who are against Christian values, all those who are promoting, for example, minority rights against the majority, which should be promoting Christian values. It's all those who challenge Western classical civilization. So it can be the myth of Europe against barbarian, and in that case, it's very often connected in the contemporary narrative about Russian narrative about migrants. All those who defend kind of postmodern theory that would be negating national identities, and all those who consider that there are some rights, supranational rights to intervene against state sovereignty. So it's both ideological and it has very clear foreign policy strategy for Russia. And then fascisti are also those who deny the Yalta Order and those who equate communism and Nazism. And that's where the Russian narrative is making this connection that sounds for us kind of distorted, to connect fascist with those that are in fact equating communism and Nazism. And that's where we have these ambiguities of saying that the Ukrainian government can be both led by a Jewish person and be at the same time anti-Semite, because on one side they are referring to that values, on the other side they are referring to this one. So some concluding remarks now, so we can then after open the floor for discussion. There are a lot of literature about the insecure Europeanness of Central Europe and Eastern Europe now that they have joined the European Union, but that's interesting to see that for Russia the relationship to Europe is still a very important one. And I really do not share some of the expert narrative or analysis about Russia turning toward Asia and so on. The Russia-China relationship is a purely kind of pragmatic one. The real ideological issues for Russia is to know what is the nature of its connection to Europe and to the West. For Russia, the authentic Europe is the one that is promoting both Christian values, but also Yalta Order, and therefore a certain vision of Europe. So the point for Russia is to know who is renegotiating the post-Cold War European order and who is revisionist. Is that Russia who is revisionist, or is that the new Europe, which is in fact a revisionist of the Yalta order? So the reading of the Second World War is that if the Soviet Union did not defeat Nazism, but is equally to it, then Russia has no right to weigh in on European matters, because Russia would be representing the same ideological element, component, or value than Nazi. So the goal for the Russian state is to keep its status as the winner over fascism, not only for domestic audience issues and legitimacy of the Putin's regime toward its own population. It's also because through that, Russia is saying that it's protecting a certain conception of what Europe's mean and of its legitimacy for being part of this Europe. And that's where I think we see how that the real issue is who owns the narrative to label who is fascist. And this narrative, once you control the labeling of fascism, you control the narrative about who is European and who is not. So the Central European, Eastern European narrative is that you have an authentic Europe that has to fight today against a Russia which is both the heir of Stalinism and on a certain way equate that the Stalin regime equates the Nazi one, and therefore Russia is the antithesis of European values. Or you have the Russian narrative saying that the authentic Europe is opposed to the fake or the anti-European Europe, being this liberal, decadent Europe. So that's how Russia, I think, is very much trying, and that's how I think it's interesting to look at what happened in Ukraine through this prism. Russia is using the Second World War narrative not only for it toward its own public opinion, but also because it's the only way to say it's legitimate to be a European actor and to act on the European political scene as a legitimate one. If Russia loses this legitimacy that it had thanks to its status of winner of the Second World War, then it's losing, in a sense, its right to act in Europe, and it's therefore losing also its right to act in the western neighborhood on its western neighborhood. So I think the issue is really larger than just Ukraine, but Ukraine has been the crystallizing element where this kind of labeling fight has been going over. And this memory war will probably stay here for long in Europe. And something that I found really interesting is also to see how much we tend not to see the connection between this memory war around the Second World War in Eastern Europe and some other European memory war, which are the memory war over decolonization that are heavily discussed in Western Europe. And I think if you follow European affairs and you see how much Central Europe is the one reacting violently against this current refugee crisis and is using the refugee crisis as a way to bargain with Brussels and with European institutions, you see this connection, which is not clearly formulated, about not having to share this kind of Western European decolonization issues, but having to deal with other memory wars that are going on with Russia over the Second World War, and that has this kind of policy implication now about interpreting what is happening in Europe over the refugee crisis. So I think this memory wars and kind of repertoire will continue to be used by Russia because they are more or less one of the only key kind of almost philosophical element that Russia can still play to justify its role and its right to participate in European affairs. And I think this kind of Black Sea, Eastern Mediterranean aspect is going to be something that will stay also for long. And that's where we have also this kind of strange, weird connection between the Ukrainian crisis and war and the Russian intervention in Syria. Not that they are directly connected, of course, but they are part of a movement that pushed Russia to look at this territory between Ukraine and Syria, this kind of Black Sea, in a very broad sense, as something absolutely critical to decide Russia's status in Europe and as the world power. And maybe I will stop here so we can have time for discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for this very rich and very stimulating and fascinating presentation. I usually open up the floor to discussion, but given the kind of authoritarian tilt to much of what we just heard, I will adapt to the circumstances and ask the first question. And gosh, I have so many. I'll start with what you ended with, and that is the Black Sea and Eastern Mediterranean aspect, which was a very fascinating part of your presentation. But I'm wondering how you would connect it with policy towards Turkey and the interaction with Turkey, because Turkey too has certain policy priorities in the area, and there is a certain history in Russian-Turkish relations. And some of what you were describing as Russia's attempts to further its Mediterranean and Black Sea policy may be in some kind of disjuncture with the other aspects. So could you give us a little bit more about that tension?
Yeah, I think I think there are several lines inside the Russian foreign policy, and of course there can be some contradictory one. The relationship to Turkey is a very complex one, and historically, of course, they do not share a lot. I mean, they share more competition than pure kind of shared interest. And what is clearly happening now, I think, is that they have this kind of current pragmatic cooperation on the ground to support the Syrian regime and to try to secure this kind of Syrian, Iranian-backed legitimacy. At the same time, clearly on the Kurdish issue, they could have some kind of conflict to come. So I think it's more a kind of conjecture that allow them to work closely together, especially because the Erdogan regime has been changing its position so rapidly on many issues and now being at odds with the US policy in the region. But I think both countries, they still find room of interaction and kind of connection because they both have this kind of ambiguous relationship to Europe. And I think in a sense now the Turkish position is even clearer about refusing Europe as a model when the Russian narrative is about refusing the liberal West but not refusing the conservative Europe as a reference. So in a sense Russia still have in its discursive space a lot of shared element with Europe that Turkey has recently kind of cut in a more very clear way.
Of course, your focus was on Russia and on Putin, but from the point of view of Turkey and Erdogan, one could make a lot of arguments why Ukraine, well, taking into account Crimea and some other things, that Turkey and Ukraine would have much more in common than Turkey
and
with
Russia.
Putin's Russia.
Yeah, but that same the pool of historical arguments to be used always depend on kind of strategic situation, and it seems Turkey and Ukraine didn't succeed in creating this connection where they would have had historical arguments to play that together, but they kind of failed for the moment in building that, and Russia has been taking over on some other arguments, historical argument that could be used. But I agree, the Black Sea issue is a key one where historically they wouldn't be on the same side. Yeah.
Okay, I had Professor Soroka and then Mr. Isai. I'll take names in threes. George?
Should I start? Thank you for that wonderful talk. I hope I'll be allowed to ask a two-part question, a compound question. The first part of this talk I was really interested in was the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in all of this. Now, of course, the Church is not monolithic, and the Church has interests that don't always follow those of the state. I mean, I'm thinking, if I remember this correctly, Kirill was not present when Putin announced the annexation of Crimea. As far as I know, the Russian Orthodox Church still has more parishes in Ukraine than it did in Russia. Certainly was the case at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union. So I was wondering if you could give us a little bit more color on that. Who specifically is pushing this narrative that coincides with the Kremlin, and are there significant forces pushing back against it? The other part of the question, and I'll try to make this quick, is you mentioned that, and this is really interesting to me because I work on this right now, but you mentioned that the West and Russia have pretty much agreed on, still to a large degree, on a narrative of how World War II is seen. But it seems to me that the West is uncomfortable with this conflation of Stalinism with Nazism precisely because it took so long to deal with the legacy of the Holocaust. And just as it finally came, in the 80s, to some resolution on this in Germany, here comes Eastern Europe. The EU said to them, you basically have to deal with this legacy before you can join. And then they join, May 2004, they say, aha, now you have to listen to us.
Yeah.
Right? Russia also has never really fully dealt with that legacy. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about, are they just partners by fiat? Is there something deeper? Is Russia beginning to deal with the Holocaust legacy as kind of a corollary to this rapprochement with Western Europe as opposed to the Eastern European narrative?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, on the Russian Orthodox Church is really an interesting aspect. I think they mostly, when the Russian Orthodox Church disagree with the Kremlin, it's mostly its interpretation of Stalinism, clearly, where the Russian Orthodox Church is much more critical than the regime in mourning the victims, and it's the near abroad, the so-called near abroad. So the Church is not sharing entirely the Russian foreign policy toward Ukraine. They were also not sharing toward Georgia in 2008. And during a certain number of years, the Georgian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church were the only kind of para-diplomacy elements where the two states could still negotiate while officially the relationship were kind of broken. So the Church is more flexible on near abroad issues because it has to maintain its kind of relationship to some state, and he wants to preserve the canonical territory that the church has without creating too many geopolitical tensions. So on the Ukrainian aspect, the church has been softer and much more conciliatory than the government. On the kind of far abroad or general foreign policy, the church and the state are working very closely together, and they share the majority of their interest. In all the reconciliation with the Russian Orthodox Church abroad, they were exactly on the same lines, both not Kirill, but at that time Patriarch Alexei and Putin were exactly on the same line on the way they have been fighting to get back the parishes that refused to join the Moscow Patriarchate after the reconciliation. The Russian state has been backing the church 100% on that. On the connection in foreign policy, narrative toward the Middle East, they are on the same lines. The church has been really pushing for, Russia protecting Eastern Christian in Syria and so on. The connection with the Vatican, the government, so both the Kremlin and the church are exactly on the same line. So Kirill is considered as a more nationalist-oriented patriarch than what Alexei was. So on many aspects, they share a lot of things. It's just on the near abroad where the church strategy has to be softer, otherwise they are kind of losing their canonical territory. On the second issue, that's really a very interesting one, and I think in a sense the European narrative is diverse in itself because we still have this old Western European narrative and we have the new Eastern European narrative that cannot find a way to kind of reconcile exactly, and that has been a kind of tough difficult issues, and you see it on a lot of different memory initiatives taken in Europe. Everything related to museology is very difficult because you have to deal with these issues. On the Russian side, my impression is that the narrative about Stalin's crimes, as I said, is being kind of taken over by the church now, but the narrative on the Holocaust didn't evolve a lot since Soviet time. And so we are still in a narrative that is very much denying the Holocaust is not seen as the key element of the Second World War. And if you read all the new history textbook, the new Russian history textbook, it's really still the kind of Soviet narrative. It's first the Russian people are the one that has suffered the most in terms of number of millions of people dying, so that there is still this kind of fight for numbers, with Russians being the first population to have been dying during the Second World War. And then there is still this Soviet narrative or Soviet readings of the Nazi regime as being a kind of German nationalist regime against Eastern Europe or the Russians, and not a totalitarian regime based on an ideology of destruction. So this kind of Holocaust fundamental element of the Nazism is never very much developed, even today in Russian textbook. Which means that if you discuss with, and if you follow if you look at the kind of survey that have been done among the Russian population, people know, of course, about the Holocaust, but it didn't create this kind of taboo as it had in Western Europe, where really it's very difficult now. I mean, only few thousands of people would agree to challenge it and say that, and be really kind of negationist. In the Russian space, it's still not there, this kind of aspect. So I think on that, Russia still had a lot to do on the Holocaust. And of course, it's putting the Holocaust memory on Ukraine and the Baltic state or on Poland by saying, well, it's happened mostly on your territory, so you participated more than the Russian participated. So it's still very kind of far away, and I don't think it will really evolve soon.
If I could make one small addition to the first point, one, for me, very interesting example where not necessarily the policies of the church and the government diverge, but at least the public face has to be somewhat different, and that is the patriarchate has not yet changed the jurisdiction of the Orthodox Church in Crimea to Moscow. It's still officially part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, but part of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Mr. Isayev, and then Professor Plochy, and, oh my goodness, and then Dr. Gribstead, and then I will take Dr. Tumarkin and Paulina.
Hi, Dr. Laroa. It's a pleasure to meet you. I actually used some of your work in your book, The Name of the Nation, in a thesis that I did, and actually my master's thesis on Putin and neo-nationalism and Russian foreign policy. And I actually got published a few years back on international relations, and actually writing some pieces on Moskanovka. So it's a pleasure to actually have a chance to see you in person. My question was sort of along the lines of, you mentioned that there was not necessarily a tight knitting between all the different sort of right-wing European groups and things like that. I guess my question is, how much, I'll try and sort of put a fine point on it. I'll start a little bit more general. It'll be a quick question, but how much do you think sort of characters like Dugin, who has been cited by St. Bannon and is a great darling, and as we know, Putin is a great darling of the so-called alt-right in the West, and the whole narrative of they love Russia because they see Putinism and Russia and the so-called conservative saving the Christian European values as, of course, being very much a fight against Islamophobe or Islamification of liberal Europe, and France and Germany has allowed itself to become Islamified, and even that group that Trump cited, the group called Britain First, is a great Putin-loving group. I guess my question would be, how much do you see as sort of all of that as direct connections with, say, Moskanovka, active measures, and sort of Putin's whole strategy of destabilizing the West and spurning giving birth and rise to this type of propaganda, and I guess how much of it is sort of disparate groups and political entrepreneurs, and so I guess how much do you see as really tied to Putin as a coherent plan, and how much do you see as sort of unification of all the different weird.
Well, I think the Russian far right and U.S. far right or alt-right connection has been mostly hype. Things in the U.S. media. So they have been quoting each other, and the alt-right has been quoting or referring to Russia a lot more than the Russian side has been referring to the far right, because except Dugin, not a lot of Russian politicians or nationalists will quote the U.S. as a good example, except some very radical nationalists inspired by Ku Klux Klan and so on. But they are really, you can count them on two hands on the Russian side. So it's the alt-right who use the references to Russia for its own political fight here in the US. But if you look at the real meetings that happen or personal connection, they are really anecdotal. It's Dugin, few people around him, few people who have been linked to David Duke and Ku Klux Klan and groups in the 2000s, few skinhead leaders. It's really almost nothing. And if you go a little bit one level higher, like Steve Bannon and so on, then you lose the connection with Russia. You have it in the narrative, but not so much in terms of personal meeting. And then after, you have the connection between business circles and kind of collusion of interest or whatever you want, but it's disconnected from the ideological aspect. And I don't think it has it has anything coherent coming from the Kremlin. I think the strategy of the Kremlin is to let this space open for ideological entrepreneur to act. Sometimes it can be reused. Sometimes they cross the line and they went too far away, and then they will have some troubles at home because they made one step too much on their direction. So I don't think it's coherent. And the few information we have about how Russia today function, because the TV channel has been a big element of making this connection between the Russian state narrative, the main narrative, and promoting some of these far-right figures. And the information we have is that here also it's not coherent. it's really kind of on an individual base of people knowing this guy who will accept to talk on Russia Today while mainstream politicians will not accept, so they make the phone call and then they just get someone who is very happy to be on TV while they need someone to be on TV. So it's more this kind of almost individual anecdotal connection and nothing so structured. But not being structured is also part of the global strategy of the presidential administration to let that space open for individual initiatives.
Professor Clohet and Dr. Grimstead.
Thanks a lot. Indeed, it's a very rich presentation, and I found one of your main arguments that Europe is still central for Russian identity, self-representation. I think it's a very productive one, and certainly it helps us to go back to the 19th century and find a lot of sources of these ideas that are out there. The question that I have is dealing with the war in Ukraine, and it's a big question, but the question is about war in Ukraine and the impact that it had on the Russian nationalism. Mm-hmm. So there are 19th century roots, but what is changing? Did anything change as the result of the war and conflict in terms of the Russian nationalism, its relations to the state?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and there have been, in fact, a lot of change because it really impacted a lot the way the Russian nationalist movement was organized and was reacting or building its relationship to Putin. So what happened is that, in fact, the Russian nationalist movement was divided into a group that was supporting of Putin's before and a group that was opposing Putin. And the group that was opposing Putin was in fact gaining a certain visibility or gained a certain visibility during the Bolotnaya protests because they were on the street with the liberals saying no to Putin's regime, corruption, and saying they wanted Europe to follow a European model. And that's where all the ambiguity of this Russian nationalist movement is that if you say I want to follow European model, well, European model can also be European far right. And that's what they were looking at. In fact, when they say they are pro-European, they are pro-European far right. But it's still part of Europe. So this group of this segment of the Russian nationalist movement got totally destroyed by the Ukrainian crisis. In fact, they got destroyed by Crimea. Because then you couldn't be both nationalist and anti-Putin. Either you would have to say that Crimea annexation is illegal, and in that case, which some did, but in that case, they lost their kind of the small support they could get for the population, or they had to recognize that, well, Putin did something great for the Russian nation, and in that case, all their anti-establishment narrative was kind of collapsed. So some people were very logical with their own conviction and went to fight on the Ukrainian side. And so we have several people among very radical neo-Nazi groups who went to Kiev siding with private sector and fighting on the Ukrainian side against the government. But that's a minority. But several groups like Ruskiye, Restrukt, they got destroyed by the division inside. So, in fact, the majority sided with Putin, but then they lost their kind of appeal for anti-regime social mobilization, and few left for Ukraine or supported the Ukrainian side, and therefore got totally delegitimized inside the Russian public opinion. So on that, the Russian government, it was not done for that, but it was a kind of second result of the crisis that really helped the Putin's regime to kind of slow down the opposition emerging from Russian nationalist groups in 2011-12. So Crimea is one thing. Donbass has been a more complex one because first it's still ongoing, so we had all these fighters who went to fight in the Donbass. The few months were quite open. We know that they were really going by themselves with no support or with support by some non-directly connected to the presidential administration or to the Kremlin. Then it got kind of more institutionalized, but it's a difficult element for the government to know how to deal with the fighters, especially those who are coming back home. We know they have organized some groups of veterans of Donbass fighters. They are controlled. They are in this kind of gray space where they have some autonomy, and at the same time they are also controlled because the Kremlin wants to be sure There will not suddenly having thousands of people able to take, arms and go in the streets. So as always, it's some section of the FSB and of the military who have been assigned to kind of deal with them and work as a kind of umbrella to both protect and monitor and kind of limit them in their actions. But there could still be some repercussion depending how things will evolve.
Dr. Grimstead?
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting talk, but I still am somewhat concerned about this memory war over the Second World War. And it's maybe perhaps because in the last years or last quarter century since the fall of the Soviet Union, I've been working myself so much on issues both West and Eastern Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, on restitution, the cultural property issue. But I also see it in a broader sense of the problem that it's not just that Russia wants to be a winner over fascism, it wants to be the winner over fascism, and wants not, sometimes not even wanting to admit that there were a handshake across the elbow in 1945, which would have been the initial, when you're speaking of the 1945 order, this would have been the handshake across the elbow. But you're not having, even as that handshake was taking place within months, you're having the rejection. No, it was Stalin that won the war. And both in Soviet ideology, and this is almost a takeover, what's happening now seems almost a takeover of the Soviet ideology, that it was Stalin that won the war. And so I think there's a lot of ambiguity here that may require a little more nuances than we often think of. And again, it's not equating Russia dealing with Russia and versus Nazism versus Stalinism, but yet what you also have, even in one major Nazi ideologist, you have him saying at Nuremberg trials, our enemy in the West were Jews and Masons, but our enemy in the East were only the Bolsheviks. And so, this is a sort of on top of the sort of problem you were trying to say, and this fits into this Holocaust denial also, which is almost ironical then, that the denial of the Holocaust, that Nazis may have been saying this, but it wasn't what they were doing in the East, but they were doing, because in the East they were taking the Bolshevik cultural treasures and destroying them, whereas they may have been destroying more of the people, but their whole idea was it wasn't just they weren't just destroying Jews; they were going to get rid of all of and particularly Ukraine. The Eric Koch that I've been working with, particularly recently with his art collection, here he is saying, if there's a Ukrainian that can sit at my table, he should be killed. It's the war against Slavs as well. The Nazis were saying this too. And so that you get this very curious thing, and I think it's also curious to see now in this new Museum of Tolerance, the so-called Holocaust Museum of Russia's version, the Holocaust Museum in Moscow. You're seeing again you see dichotomies there. Yes, they're showing the registers of the Jewish dead from Yad Vashem, but they're also showing massive pictures of the destruction that was being wrought by of the whole country. So you've got both. They're trying to put both things together.
Yeah.
And all I want to caution, maybe put in a word of caution that there are some very curious nuances here that I think you may want to reconsider.
No,
a little bit
Yeah.
in this case, and it's unfortunately it's been magnified today because none of the European heads of state came to celebrate the 70th anniversary in Moscow, but they all wanted their archives back from Russia.
Yeah, no, it's
And they had to deal with the heads of state, and it was only the ones that sent the Queen of the Netherlands or the head of the French president that came to meet Putin. And they're the ones that got their archives back. So you've got these.
Yeah, ambiguity. No, a very good point. I think there is globally, in any case, a kind of nationalization of the winner of the war that is going not only in Russia but globally. I think if you look at the way the U.S. narrative has been evolving about the war, you could see also sometime this trend of trying to present the U.S. and of changing the U.S. narrative and the kind of U.S.-Soviet double winner aspect. And I've been following also the French narrative, for example, has been evolving with less and less room given to the role of the Communist Party on the French side of the debate. So I think there are many things that are evolving politically in all the countries globally. What seems to me very visible on the Russian side is the disappearance of the Soviet side. So it's Russian people alone more than Soviet nations who won the war. And a very good.
Ukrainian, there was more war in Ukraine practically and in Belarus.
And a good example of that was last year at the Russian embassy in Washington for May 9, the ambassador was trying, so he didn't know how to make his speech, and because he was speaking mostly to an American audience, and he was trying to avoid the term Soviet because he thought it wouldn't sound nice. But then the only way he had was to replace it by Russian. And then that creating this narrative about it's Russia and the US who won the war. And then I was in the room, and you had all the post-Soviet ambassadors, not all of them, of course, the Ukrainians were not there, but all the Central Asian and South Caucasian who were there, and we are like, we also won the war. How could you suddenly make it only Russian and not a Soviet thing? So they have this kind also of contradiction about nationalizing the war. And on the second, the memory issue, I think what is really interesting to follow now is the discussion in Russia about Vlasov and collaborationism, because that's really interesting. Research is going on, many people are publishing things, and at the level of the historians community, the discussion is really interesting and kind of relatively seriously done based on archives and so on. But the level of politicization of anything about collaborationism in Russia is a kind of very hot topic, and there have been, so one PhD has been denied in Russia because it was showing, because the problem of studying collaborationism, Soviet collaborationism in today's Russia is that if you try to see that some people collaborated because they wanted to fight against Stalin and the Soviet regime itself, then you got blocked. So the only way to study collaborationism is just to use the kind of, traitor, they were just kind of traitor to the homeland. That's, in that aspect you can study it. But if you try to bring that there were some people who decided to side with the Nazi, not because they were sharing Nazi ideology, but because they wanted to fight against Stalin and Stalin policy, then it gets politicized very rapidly. So this discussion
particularly true in Ukraine with the dealing with collaboration.
Yeah. Well, in the Baltic state too. Yeah.
There was a very strong element of wanting to turn the war into a war against Moscow as much as with the Germans.
Nina Tomarkin, then Paulina, then this gentleman.
Thank you. So before I pose, first of all, Marlene, that was a predictably brilliant talk, and thank you very much. So before I just pose my question, I just want to respond very quickly to you, Pat, that in the Soviet cult of the war, which began around 1965, did not focus on Stalin as having won the war. It was the Soviet system, the communist system, and the Soviet people. Although Stalin was not left out, but that wasn't primary. But I would like to go back to George Soroka's question about sort of the politics of victimization, so the second half of your question, and your response to it. In fact, as we know, World War II was not primarily about the Jews. But the narrative since the 1970s has made the Holocaust central to the European view of 1945 and beyond. And so for these four decades, now facing the Holocaust, one's role in the Holocaust, showing that a European country has gone through its Vergangenheitsbewältigung process is really, I think, basic to being considered a member of the European club. And that's why Central Europe and Eastern Europe it's one of the reasons they've had such problems. It figures into their narratives as well. But then the question is, how can Russia identify itself as European and not deal with the Holocaust as it's done? And then the other question I wanted to ask has to do with, again, the politics of victimization. I think the focus now in Russia is actually on the new martyrs. So the victims of Stalinism, the focus on the part of the church anyway, the victims of Stalinism, this church, Orthodox church in Butova, a new fresco just went up there that shows the Red Army and the Chekisti as devils, and then the holy martyrs of these thousands of people, because that's so close to the killing fields of Stalinism. And so how does that all fit? I mean, it seems to me that would factor in to kind of making Russia think about the Jews as victims even more distant, because there's a focus on these other martyrs. Anyway, I went away.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good point, and I wanted to mention that, and I forgot how much the church is playing a structural role, not only in taking care of this mourning of victims of Stalinism, but just in rewriting globally Soviet history and the role of Tsarist Russia. And I think what happened during all last year for the 100th anniversary of the revolutions of 1917, with the state being quite silent about not knowing what to do with the February Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution, and deciding to be quiet. So very vocal on Second World War and very quiet on 1917. And then, in fact, it let the floor open for the church to give more or less the only kind of structure narrative, public narrative. The Communist Party had its own, of course, but it's a known one and a small one. The church really kind of took control partly of reshaping this narrative. We have been discussing the role of this historical exhibition park, Russia My History, which is funded mostly by the church and which is a very anti-Soviet narrative about 20th century, a very pro-Tsarist narrative. And this is becoming, so it's not state validated, but it's indirectly, because the state remains silent on that, it's becoming the main narrative. So the fact that, in a sense, the church is suddenly bringing other historical elements in a historical narrative that was so much focused on Second World War now is also changing a little bit the given, because suddenly you have Tsarist Russia re-emerging, you have this kind of complex relationship to Stalinism, and so that's kind of changing a little bit the shades of the traditional Russian state-centered kind of mainstream main narrative about the Second World War. And on the Holocaust, I think it's a very difficult question, but I mean, if you follow what is happening in Poland, with currently, I think there are many countries who are still in this kind of apparent contradiction for them about how you can deal with your own feeling of being victim and accepting to recognize that others have been victim, and that you can be both victim from one group and being perpetrator of another one. And so I don't think Russia is alone in that situation. I think it's the whole part of Europe, of this part of Europe, which still managing the fact that they are both victim and perpetrator on certain occasions, and that's difficult to build this articulation. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm reminded.
No,
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Yeah, you will be next, but I think that the list has Paulina. Yes.
My name is Paulina Barsukova. I'm one of the Curis fellows here. And I come here from the meetings of the Council of the Future Siege Museum. So
You're the great poet, right?
I'm a poet.
Yes, she is. Yes, she is.
So I'm very happy that these museum narratives are mentioned, because it is my feeling that at the moment it is one of the foray, one of the arenas where narratives are being produced as we speak. For example, the Future Siege Museum is curious because it's being funded by Putin's team. And nevertheless, people who were invited are rather surprising. They're inviting Western scholars. Also, there is a conversation now about a similar project of the Stalingrad Future Museum, and we're talking to Helbeck. So, multi-mosaic collections of voices that these voices are trying to put to the table, to the conversation, I find it to be extremely curious, because this is happening simultaneously with the exhibition, or rather exhibitions that you've mentioned, right?
Yeah.
Исторический парк.
Mm.
Моя история, which is crawling and sprawling, and soon it will be most исторический парk, I'm afraid. So I would suggest to look at these conversations that are happening now as thinking tanks, precisely connected to what you're talking about. One of the most difficult screaming topics of the Future Siege museums, as you can imagine, is Blast and Второй Front, and the whole story about the exclusion of that PhD from the conversation that you mentioned. So I think it's a curious and very vibrant and very poignant and very lively nerve that is happening now. And thank you again for the amazing talk.
Thank you. Yeah, I think museology and cinema are the two spaces where you can see the debates, these kind of debates, being very alive and very kind of immediate and hot and emotional discussion, while of course history textbooks are by definition moving slowly and being very formalized and kind of neutral. So there is a huge gap between what is written in history textbook, for example, and debates about museology going on now, because one will change in the next 10 years, while museology and cinema and globally visual, everything kind of visual culture about the Second World War and more globally about all the Soviet regime, I think things are changing a lot. And you can see that the state is not the main, I mean, depending how we want to define the state in Russia, but it's not the presidential administration so much being in charge. It's many other actors around the state, all these ideological entrepreneurs who are there, and they are fighting hard on this issue. Then the state is the presidential administration is kind of in the middle, in kind of neutral or hostage position, I don't know. So you're right, I think all these museum issues will be really kind of showing the way the discussion will be evolving.
You had shown in one of the slides a map of the European Union and Nazi Europe in 1942. And I was reminded of what Napoleonic Europe would look like in 1811. So in terms of views of history under the current regime, is there a commentary going on about the Congress of Vienna as the altar of the early 19th century, and somehow Russia as the guarantor of a conservative Europe?
Yes, so that's a good point you're mentioning that, because yes, so one of the main ideological entrepreneur of all the around Ukraine, all the different Crimea, Novorossiya aspect, and more globally the connection to European far right, Konstantin Malofeyev, this Orthodox businessman who is connected in fact to the church and to Father Tikhon, and through him probably, but not so directly, to Putin, has been the big one pushing for this kind of Metternich Holy Alliance narrative. And so he organized in 2014, in June, what he called a secret meeting, but it was everywhere in newspaper, so not so secret, meeting to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the Holy Alliance. And he invited in Vienna a lot of European far-right leaders, both kind of populist leaders, kind of French National Fronts, and more really radical groups. Dugin was there. There was several white emigre descendants, Russian aristocratic families who participate in that meeting with the hope to recreate a kind of, the new conservative Europe under Russia's leadership. So the narrative or the symbolic reference to the Holy Alliance is there. And I think, on many aspects, that's something that the Russian state, that's an historical element or symbol the Russian state could use. But in fact, they mostly use Soviet kind of Yalta time reference. They don't go back so much in time, but they could totally use that. Yeah.
We still have about 10 minutes, so I'm ready to take list number 2, this young lady, and then Dr. Shabeli. Please.
I'm glad that you're interested. You mentioned film, because I've been following some of the kind of rhetoric surrounding Matilda, and then also surrounding the film The Death of Stalin.
Yeah.
And you've seen people getting upset, sometimes on the same grounds and principles, but very different reactions. At least in the government, there was calls for the government to accommodate protests against Matilda based on, kind of being offensive to the memory of the Tsar, but that not actually happening in terms of any government intervention, but actually that it is happening in terms of the death of Stalin. So do you think that there's anything there that kind of relates to what we're talking about today in terms of how the protest surrounding these different films has actually been accommodated one way or another?
Yeah, I think what is happening is that during years, the Putin's regime has been very flexible in terms of ideological references, letting a lot of space for whoever wanted to use a large array of ideological references, except liberalism, of course, Western liberalism. But all the other references were accepted. You could be pro-Stalin, pro-Nikolai II, pro-Stolypin. Everything was kind of fine if you were still accepting the regime as it was. And it gave the regime a lot of flexibility to adapt. In fact, it made it very plastic and therefore very able to react to change in public opinion or to satisfy all the different social groups in Russia. But clearly, since last year, it's becoming more difficult to manage this whole spectrum. And what I think they were not prepared is to see that until recently, all these ideological entrepreneurs, they were outside the state structure. They were around it, having either business or personal connection or some institutional connection, but they were not the state in the sense the government itself. So you could always play with them and limit them when they were going too far. Now, with what's happened with Matilda, is that when suddenly you have people like Natalia Poklonskaya becoming very vocal and directly attacking Medinsky, and you suddenly have inside the state structure 2 people with official title and real institutional legitimacy inside the system, saying the contrary to each other, one for, one against, and so on. And that's something that it suddenly creates more dissonant voices than what the regime was prepared to see. And then I think they were also not prepared to imagine that around Matilda, that there would be this connection between some people inside the church, some street movement who have their own small niche, but it's still people able to go in the street and burn cars, and suddenly official figure like Poklonskaya, and seeing this connection, from inside the state to a big institution to street people, because the classic Russian nationalist far-right people like Dugin or those who have been fighting in Donbass, they don't display the same kind of connection, and they are more easily manageable when they go too far. The state no more, like the regime knows how to kind of calm them down. This orthodox kind of line of activism was a surprise, I think, for the presidential administration. They didn't imagine it would be strong like that. So that took them by surprise, I think. More than the kind of Donbass, fighters, which they knew they would be able to control because it's more connected to FSB or military people. So once you send information about, okay, guys, you did enough now, we stop and we will take that ourselves and kind of make that a clean occupation, that works. While when it's kind of this orthodox fundamentalism, that they were not prepared, I think, to see that emerging.
Professor Chevy?
Thank you, Marlene. Fascinating talk. My question is sort of political sciencey, and as such is maybe not quite fair. And I don't have any. I would be hard pressed to give an answer myself. But I just wanted to ask you, how do you think about these things, right? And my question pertains to sort of the limits of this ideological kind of creativity, right? And the shifts that we see, right? Because people who have been talking about Russian nationalism, right, and sort of Russian thinking about itself and its place in the world and in Europe, have noted, with Veratols and others, and yourself, how there is a lot of kind of room for maneuver there, right? But then on the other hand, right, people, when we sort of think of, the scholars who work on kind of the importance of identities, right, that another argument could be made that people have certain identities, including political leaders, right, and they see the world a certain way, and that actually constrains the range of choices that they would be willing to make, right, or the range of sort of narratives that they would offer, right? So in case of Russia and all of these narratives about, fascists and Europeanness and so forth, to what extent do you see the Russian elites kind of open to, wheeling and dealing and proposing different narratives that would serve their kind of material interest at any given point in time, right? And to what extent these narratives that they would put forth are really kind of shaped and constrained by some deeply held sets of beliefs that they maybe get socialized in their younger years, right? Or the books that they write, or whatever philosophers that we hear that put in, certain philosophers and so forth, right? And again, I understand that, there may not be kind of definitive answer to that, but from the research that you've been doing, on which set of the scales, right, kind of the story falls, as in the elites being the strategic and manipulative and, offering whatever self-serving narratives, right, or the elites being, these people who do believe certain things very deeply, right, and can only move so far away from their own sets of beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's of course a great question. I think on many aspects the elites do believe, so there is both, of course, a kind of purely cynical use of some ideological elements or arguments or topics that are just launched to the public opinion, and then if they don't work, and then they can just be, trashed, and then you just move to another concept. So there is this kind of polittechnologia, creativity, it's one side. But I think the Russian elite, political elite, do believe in a certain number of things about the cynicism of the international order, the fact that there is no real values or ideals, that everything is kind of negotiable, and that the West or the US is showing by its geopolitical role and strategy that in fact it's all about cynicism and just kind of great power, real politics. I think they really believe in that, and I think their relationship, the way they situate Russia, make them for them to see Europe as the only way of identifying with. I don't think, there are very few people among the Russian political elite who looks to Asia or to the Middle East or to other parts of the world as model they would follow. So they are still stuck with this notion that Europe, the West or the transatlantic West and the liberal West is the enemy, but Europe is still a model on many aspects. And because they have been, and that's where I think the socializing aspect is very important. If you try to see the trajectory of these elites, and of course depending how we want to define them, it's people who are mostly in their 50s now, let's say, they are late Soviet citizens. They have been socialized in the 70s, and their world in the 70s was a world where Europe and the West was more or less the best you can do, with some Soviet cultural elements that were appreciated. And I think since then they have been kind of trying to find a way to negotiate this kind of, late Soviet culture that was very much valorized and they were part of. And this kind of myth that the West, as it was in the 70s when you were on the other side of the Iron Curtain, what the mythical things you wanted to attain. And so in a sense, they spend their time negotiating the disillusion that once you don't have any more Iron Curtain, the West doesn't look as you dreamed it would look when you were in your 20s. So I'm sorry, it's kind of very psychological, cheap psychological analysis, but I think it's the way the West were portrayed for educated Soviet part of the population in the 70s is a key element to explain this kind of, we won't be part of you but not part of you on that aspect, we but don't this one, we like this one, but we were preferring you when you were something else that we thought we would be reaching, and once we can reach you, you became something else, you are not the West we have been dreaming about. I think it's still very much there. The core element is this kind of 70s or late Soviet culture and relationship to the West. But I agree it should be, it's said in a very non-scholarly manner. It should be worked out.
Our timing is exquisite. We just reached exactly the hour of 6. I would just like to say that for me, your presentation was not just an event in itself, but it seems to open up doors to new ways of looking at things, because your talk has not only the words fascism and conservatism in it, it has semantics. Mm-hmm. And it has been something that has been bothering me personally, that many people, including scholars, use the same words, the same vocabulary, and mean very different things by them. Mm-hmm. And I think that you have pointed out some of the important distinctions that come, and it's something that I think we should all learn from and apply in our own work. So thank you on behalf of everyone. And
thank you so much for inviting me.